They said I was embarrassing. Imagine that. After everything I've paid for, everything I've built, everything I've buried quietly, so they could live neatly on top of it, I became the one who made them uncomfortable. She said it right there in the driveway, with her perfect manicure flashing in the sunlight and her voice pitched just low enough for the neighbors not to hear, but not so low that I could pretend I'd misheard. You make things awkward, Marianne. People notice. People. The word was her shield, always plural, always vague. I just smiled because that's what you do when your son's wife tells you you've become a social liability. You smile so the world won't see the break. I walked back inside that house, the house with the marble counters I helped pay for, the house where my name is still on the deed, though they pretend otherwise, and I thought, this is how they do it. Not with cruelty, with civility, with scented candles and neutral tones, with the kind of politeness that peels the skin off you, one courtesy at a time. I am 74 years old. I rent a small place now, a converted attic with slanted ceilings and a window that looks out over the back of a grocery store. It smells of yeast and asphalt when it rains, but it's mine. I make coffee in the mornings, the cheap kind, and I drink it standing up because there's no room for a proper table. Sometimes I watch the pigeons on the ledge and imagine they're keeping guard, small gray witnesses to what happened, to the long, slow way I disappeared from my own life. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time I belonged somewhere, or at least I thought I did. When Daniel first bought that house, he called it our family's future. I remember the day vividly, him standing in the half-finished kitchen, wires still dangling from the ceiling, saying, "Mom, this is stability." I had laughed, proud and tired, because stability was something I'd worked for all my life. Double shifts, at the clinic, skipped holidays, years of small sacrifices folded into grocery envelopes. I sold the last of my savings bonds to help with his down payment. "Just until I refinance," he said. Of course I believed him. Mothers believe their sons long after the world stops giving them reasons to. Carla came later, smooth as polished glass. She had that effortless grace that looks expensive even when it isn't. The first time she called me Mom, I almost cried. I thought maybe, finally, I was being folded into something new. Instead, I was being wrapped up to be stored away. I didn't see it at first. That's the trick with people like her. They don't push you out all at once. They redecorate you out of the picture. The framed photos on the mantel changed, first subtly, then completely. My son's graduation photo disappeared. The family Christmas portrait where I stood at the end, holding baby Kieran, was replaced by a glossy shot of Carla's parents in Rome. Even the dishes I'd given them for their wedding were moved to the basement for safekeeping. Every gesture was reasonable, explainable, and entirely effective. The first real wound came one Saturday afternoon. They were hosting what Carla called a neighbor social. I wore my best dress, the navy one with the small silver buttons. Carla met me at the bottom of the stairs and said softly, "Maybe change into something lighter. It's just that the crowd is a bit formal." She handed me a beige cardigan that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. I put it on because that's what peace looked like in their house, acquiescence. During the party, I stayed near the kitchen, helping refill glasses and smiling when introduced as a family friend visiting from Oregon. A friend. My own son nodded along, eyes darting anywhere but at me. That was the first time I felt the small, bright snap of something inside me breaking. After that, I was trimmed from their lives like an untidy edge. Invitations stopped. Phone calls became short, logistical, perfunctory. When I offered to babysit, Carla said, "Oh, we don't want to tire you out." When I asked about Sunday dinners, Daniel said, "We're keeping things simple this month." Simple, that word again, the polite synonym for without you. I started to feel like a misplaced photograph, something they meant to keep but couldn't find room for on the wall. It's strange how invisibility creeps. At first, you fight it. You talk louder, bake more, try harder. Then one day, you stop bringing pies because no one eats them, and you realize silence demands less energy than hope. I began moving through their house like a guest, careful not to touch too much, not to linger in doorways. The maid smiled at me more warmly than my own family did. Once, I heard Carla on the phone telling someone, "She's sweet, but a bit much." I wasn't supposed to hear it. She was in the kitchen, her back to me, and the words slipped out between laughs. A bit much. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, staring at the reflection in the glass cabinet door, wondering when exactly I'd become excessive. The night it all truly cracked, the baby was crying upstairs, and Daniel was trying to calm her. Carla was scrolling through her phone, irritation etched deep between her brows. I offered to help, to rock the baby, just for a few minutes. Carla didn't even look up. "No, it's fine. You make her overstimulated." Overstimulated. As if my heartbeat offended her. Daniel said nothing. He never did. Later, as I was leaving the room, I heard her whisper, "She's just embarrassing sometimes." His reply came soft, tired, and final. "I know." Those two words followed me all night. They followed me into the guest room, where the sheets smelled like detergent and distance. They followed me into the mirror, where I couldn't recognize the woman staring back, a woman whose kindness had been mistaken for weakness, whose generosity had been repackaged as intrusion. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my purse, and touched the envelope I always carried, the one with the deed to the house, my name still printed cleanly beside my son's, proof that I existed not just in memory, but in ink, in law, in ownership. For the first time in years, the paper felt heavier than its weight. In the morning, when the house was quiet, I made myself coffee in their silent kitchen. Carla's white orchids stared at me from the windowsill like delicate sentinels. The machine gurgled expensively, spitting out a thin stream of bitterness. I poured it into a mug that said, "Best Grandma Ever," the one they'd given me as a stocking stuffer, probably picked up last minute at a gas station. I looked around the immaculate counters, the curated furniture, the sterile perfection of a home that had no room for history, and I understood. I wasn't embarrassing because I spoke too much or wore the wrong dress. I was embarrassing because I reminded them of everything real: sacrifice, aging, debt, imperfection, truth. I carried my cup to the back patio. The morning light made the garden look staged, each flower color coordinated with the patio cushions. The grass was too green, too precise. I remembered planting marigolds with Daniel when he was 10, his small hands stained with soil, his laugh quick and careless. I wondered if he remembered that day, or if memory, like gratitude, fades faster for some people. When the wind shifted, I heard Carla's voice inside, already on the phone, already planning the next gathering, already replacing me in every detail of the life I thought we shared. I stood there a long time, the coffee cooling in my hand, until I realized I wasn't sad. Not exactly. I was waiting. For what, I didn't yet know, only that it would start the moment I stopped pretending this was still my home. That was the morning I decided silence would no longer be my strategy. I didn't announce it. I didn't slam doors or cry. I simply went upstairs, packed my bag, and took the envelope from the drawer where I'd kept it hidden. My hands didn't shake. The act of reclaiming, even in secret, steadied them. I left a note on the counter. Thank you for the hospitality. Nothing more. By the time they returned from their errands, I would be gone. But before I left, I took one last look at the house through the open doorway. Sunlight spilled across the floor, bright and cold, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty isn't the same as belonging. They said I was embarrassing. Maybe I was. Maybe it's embarrassing to love people who would rather erase you than admit what you've given. Maybe it's embarrassing to age, to remember, to still believe that family means something. Or maybe it's only embarrassing when the truth stands in a room built entirely on performance. Either way, I stopped apologizing that day. I stepped out into the daylight with my small suitcase, the deed folded carefully beside my wallet, and walked down the street until the house disappeared behind the trees. The air smelled different beyond their gate, less curated, more alive. I didn't look back. You can't, once you've seen what they really think of you. And that was the beginning, though at the time it felt like the end. The morning after I left their house, the sky looked like tin, the kind that threatens rain but never delivers it. I walked until the blisters on my heels began to whisper against my shoes, past the polished lawns, and the symmetry of lives that didn't seem to bend under the weight of love or guilt. I stopped at the corner cafe because I needed to sit somewhere that didn't smell of money. The waitress didn't recognize me, which was a relief. She poured coffee that tasted honest, burnt, and unpretentious, and asked if I wanted cream. I said no. I'd had enough softening agents in my life. I sat there for almost an hour, watching condensation trail down the window and thinking about the years that had led me to that small table. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't shout. It hums. It lives in gestures so small you almost bless them as kindness until you add them all up and realize you've been erased politely. When I first helped Daniel buy that house, I signed my name beside his and felt a strange mix of pride and relief. My late husband, Peter, had always said, "Leave the boy something that lasts." I thought I was doing exactly that. What I didn't realize was that I was also signing away my place in the narrative. The first time Carla hinted that my name might be a complication, she did it with a laugh. "Oh, the bank gets confused about multiple owners," she said. "It's just paperwork." She was always laughing when she wanted something removed. A picture frame, a holiday visit, a person. By the time I noticed, she'd already redone the kitchen without asking my opinion, though I'd paid for the marble. "You wouldn't like this style anyway," she'd said, smiling. And I had agreed because that's what I did back then. Agreeing felt safer than being accused of ingratitude. After I left, I checked into a small roadside motel on the edge of town. The room smelled of bleach and tired travelers. The television didn't work, and the lamp flickered, but the silence was solid, and I hadn't felt solid in years. I spread the deed on the bedspread, tracing my name with the edge of my finger. It was there, unshakable, legal, undeniable. The more I looked at it, the clearer it became. They wanted my contribution, not my presence. That house had been built with my sacrifice, but its doors were closed to the woman who made it possible. There are betrayals that bruise you, and ones that disassemble you. Theirs did both. The next day, I went to the bank. The clerk was young enough to call me ma'am twice in a single sentence. I asked to see the records of the property account and the payments I'd made over the years. She hesitated, glancing at the screen, then asked, "Are you still listed as a co-owner?" I nodded. She printed the documents and handed them to me in a neat folder. I thanked her and stepped outside before opening it. There it was, my name, in small black letters beside Daniel's, a quiet truth on official paper. And below it, the most recent correspondence, the refinance I was never told about. My share hadn't been bought out. It had been ignored, as if omission could erase legality. That was when the coldness hit, not the rage. Rage burns, but cold hardens, and hardened things don't break easily. That evening, I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring, his voice tight, polite. "Mom, where are you?" "Carla's worried." I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I said, "I saw the bank statement." He exhaled sharply. "Mom, it's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "You refinanced the mortgage without telling me." He muttered something about timing, paperwork, how he meant to call. Then the sentence that broke the last piece of pretense. "It's just that Carla and I thought it might be simpler legally if your name wasn't involved anymore." Simpler again. That word, the convenient knife of the well-bred. I asked, "Did you remove me?" "Not exactly," he said. "We just restructured." The way he said it, as if betrayal were a spreadsheet adjustment, made me laugh. He didn't join me. That night, I walked to a laundromat near the motel. The machines clattered like small trains, carrying other people's mistakes. I sat on the plastic chair and watched the dryers spin, thinking about the word mother. It's supposed to be permanent, not negotiable. You spend decades being the axis of someone's existence, and one day they redraw the map without you. Somewhere between rinse and spin, I decided to call a lawyer, not out of revenge, not even out of pride. I just wanted to be seen by someone whose job it was to read what others pretend not to notice. The following morning, I walked into a legal aid office downtown. It smelled of paper and determination. The receptionist was kind but cautious. "Do you have documentation?" she asked. I handed her the folder, the one I'd slept beside on the motel bed. She scanned the first page, then looked at me with something like recognition. "You're still a legal co-owner," she said. "They can't just ignore that." Her tone wasn't surprised. It was tired, the way people sound when they've seen the same cruelty dressed in 1,000 polite forms. She brought me to an older woman named Ms. Campbell, a lawyer with gray hair pulled tight and eyes that missed nothing. She asked questions, efficient and direct. When I finished, she sat back and said, "If they're using your property without acknowledgement, you have every right to file for partition or compensation, but you have to be ready. It will change things permanently." I smiled, small and steady. Things already changed. I left the office with a pamphlet and a card that felt heavier than it looked. On the way back to the motel, I passed a park where 2 boys were flying a kite. One of them shouted, "Don't let go!" And the other laughed, his grip tight on the string. I thought about how many times I had let go to make room for others, how much of myself I'd given away to keep the peace. Peace is expensive when you're the only one paying for it. Back in the room, I made a list of everything I'd contributed to that house. Mortgage payments, taxes, repairs. The numbers didn't lie, even if my son did. When I finished, I sat quietly, the air conditioner humming like an indifferent witness. Betrayal is usually imagined as an event, a single moment of rupture, but this was slower, deliberate. It was the accumulation of small edits, each one shaving away a little more of my existence until I was meant to vanish naturally, conveniently, without complaint. They underestimated me. They thought love meant compliance. They forgot I once built a life from nothing but night shifts and stubbornness. When Daniel called again that evening, I didn't answer. He left a message. "We can talk about this. Carla's sorry if things were misunderstood." Misunderstood. That's another word that hides guilt in silk. I replayed it once, then deleted it. I wasn't interested in misunderstandings anymore. I was interested in clarity, in signatures, in truth with teeth. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. I dreamt of the old house before Carla's furniture, before the stage perfection. I saw Daniel as a boy, building pillow forts in the living room, laughing, calling for me to look. I woke with tears on my face, but a calmness in my chest. I understood something essential. Love can survive without contact, but dignity cannot. The next morning, I mailed the documents to Ms. Campbell with a note. Proceed. I didn't sign it. Mom, I signed it. Marianne Cross. It felt right, like reclaiming a version of myself I'd misplaced somewhere between forgiveness and fear. As I slid the envelope into the postbox, a light rain began to fall, soft but insistent. I stood there a moment, letting it soak through my coat. For years, I'd avoided the rain because Carla once said it made my hair frizz. Now, the damp air felt like absolution. I wasn't fragile anymore. I was simply awake. That was the day the betrayal stopped being private. It turned into action, quiet, deliberate, legal. They had treated me as an inconvenience. Now they would have to look me in the eye across a courtroom. That, I suppose, is the real catalyst. Not anger, not revenge, but the moment you decide you deserve witnesses. And I did. I thought that once I mailed the paperwork, the world would announce itself with thunder. But the first escalation didn't roar. It collected like fog, a thickness that made each breath feel slightly rationed. Small things came first, the kinds of things you could call accidents if you needed a story to keep the peace, like the bank card that mysteriously stopped working when I tried to pay for the motel, weak in cashless fashion, and the polite young man at the counter asking if I had another method, and how, when I called the bank, the hold music lapped at my ear for 26 minutes before a representative told me, in the same careful tone you'd use with a nervous horse, that there had been security changes initiated from a primary, household contact, which was a long ribbon of words that meant my son had flagged an account we once shared for emergencies, and the system decided to protect him from me. I walked to the ATM and withdrew what I could from my own separate savings, the one thing I had kept in a quiet corner of my life, like a lamp with a working bulb. And then I bought a paper notebook because if people wanted to blur me out, I would answer by sharpening everything, dates and times and names in ink that didn't apologize, a ledger of the slow, civilized cruelty that passes for concern in certain neighborhoods. The calls began the next morning. First Daniel, with a voice as crisp as a hospital sheet, telling me that Carla was very upset and maybe we could meet with a mediator to de-escalate the situation. And I heard how that word, de-escalate, turned me into the problem that needed soothing, a fever to be brought down rather than a person who had been quietly deprived of oxygen for years. And I said, we were beyond mediation. We were in the realm of documentation, where memory had witnesses and signatures. And he sighed like men do when the women they counted on to be endlessly reasonable develop a spine that won't fold under their preferred weight. Then the texts arrived in a bouquet of silence, little dots appearing and vanishing from Daniel's number. And from Carla's phone, a single message that almost made me laugh with how perfectly engineered it was. Hi, Marianne. Just checking that you're safe. We're so worried. If you need anything at all, please let us know. Sending love. The red heart like a sticker over a bruise. And I read it twice to make sure I hadn't invented the condescension. And then I put my phone face down because I was learning that not every performance requires an audience. 2 days later, there came a knock on the motel door, and since no one knew my room number except the desk clerk and Ms. Campbell, I felt that familiar trickle of dread, the one that had kept me docile for years. But it was a uniformed officer and a woman in a cardigan with a clipboard, both of them friendly, both of them trained to wear friendliness like a soft armor. And they said there had been a welfare call from a concerned family reporting that I might be vulnerable or confused and possibly being manipulated by outside influences. And I almost asked them if those outside influences were the laws of the state or the lawyer with a bar number. But I kept my mouth level and handed over my ID and my prescription list and the neat folder of co-ownership documents I had begun carrying like a passport to my own life. And the woman in the cardigan, her name, tag said Lena, nodded in that way that said she understood more than she could say on duty, and she asked if I felt safe, if I had food, if I needed assistance, and I offered them stale crackers and the truth that I had more safety in a room that smelled of bleach than in a house that smelled of rosemary and judgment. And they left with polite apologies, which is the closest thing to accountability a welfare check can offer. Later that afternoon, the motel clerk told me, with the resigned air of a man who had seen too many domestic storms, that a woman had been asking whether I'd checked out. Elegant, high heels, the kind who doesn't blink when she's lying, he said, and I didn't need a name, because sometimes the pattern itself is a signature. I moved the next day to a month-to-month rental above a nail salon, a place with a narrow kitchen and a long window that looked over a parking lot punctuated by shopping carts. And in that small space, I found a rhythm that didn't ask permission, coffee that tasted like coffee, the radio low and kind, the crackle of the nail salon's laughter rising up the stairwell in bursts of lacquer and gossip like a choir practicing for a secular hymn. And at night, I read the statute printouts Ms. Campbell had given me, tracing the language with my finger as if it were Braille, learning the architecture of how a person like me could be removed from a story and then returned with the help of clauses and precedent. The escalation continued like a polite avalanche. A letter slid under my door with no return address that managed to call me both beloved and irresponsible in the same paragraph. Signed in Daniel's tight penmanship with a postscript that said, "We don't want to bring lawyers into this, but we will if you force us," which landed like a balcony performance of nobility from someone who had already hired a man in a gray suit to stand outside the cafe like a weather vane for intimidation. And I placed the letter in my notebook with a square of tape because curation can work both ways. Ms. Campbell called to say that opposing counsel had reached out to discuss options to preserve family harmony. And when I asked if family harmony included erasing my legal presence, she made a small sound that might have been a laugh and said, "No, harmony in this context usually means a discount for the party being dismissed." And I told her there would be no discounts, only arithmetic. And she said good, in a tone like a blessing that had the word finally hidden inside it. Meanwhile, the mayim world around me adjusted. The neighbor downstairs with the small dog began saving me the morning paper after the salon closed. The clerk at the corner store started calling me Miss M and kept aside the good bananas because he said I looked like someone who disliked waste, and each of those small kindnesses was a stitch in a fabric I had forgotten could hold me. Small proofs that the universe would not collapse if I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Of course, Carla adapted. People like her, are fluent in narrative. And soon, a community post appeared in one of those neighborhood groups. Someone sent me a screenshot with a gentle query about resources for aging relatives acting out, and whether anyone had suggestions for supporting a loved one through cognitive decline. And I stared at my name, omitted but present, a ghost that still managed to be accused, and for a moment the old shame returned, because they love to weaponize the body you inhabit, to turn your years into evidence, your slowness into pathology, your insistence into imbalance. And then I remembered the welfare check and the officer's apology and Ms. Campbell's unblinking eyes, and I said out loud to the empty room that I was done auditioning for the role of reasonable mother. The quiet pressure spread to my calendar. My medical portal pinged with a notice that someone had attempted to change my emergency contact, and the pharmacy called to confirm that I still wanted my prescriptions. Yes, I told them, I still wanted my life. And I added the pharmacy clerk's name to my notebook, because we forget that resistance is built from allies who bag our pills and print our receipts and look us in the eye like we're still here. The hearing date arrived in an email that made my chest flutter with a fear that was not weakness, but adrenaline, because the body had learned to associate rooms with judges with every story it had absorbed from the world about women like me being asked to prove we weren't hysterical while their accusers presented as responsible citizens wearing good shoes. And I went to the thrift store and bought a navy jacket that fit me as if it had been tailored by a seamstress who believed in second chances. And I practiced speaking my own name without hesitation, because in their house I had been coached to soften it, to step aside, to be mom or Mary or you, a pronoun to be shuffled. The escalation took one more turn when Daniel called late at night, his voice crumbling at the edges like bread left out. And he said he missed me, and that Carla had gone too far, and that he didn't know how to fix it. And I wanted to say, run. The house is on fire, and you're the one with the match. But I didn't. I told him I loved him, and that loving him did not mean surrendering my rights. And he grew quiet and promised to talk to her, which struck me as a sentence from a man who believed conversation could mend what convenience had torn. The next day, an email from Carla arrived, longer than usual, with paragraphs blooming in rationalities, a list masquerading as compromise. If I withdrew the petition, they would consider a formal acknowledgement of past contributions, perhaps even a framed photo added to the hallway, and maybe a holiday schedule that included me in alternating years, and perhaps this was the sparkle on the poison, an annual stipend to make. Sure, I felt appreciated. And I read those words 3 times, stipend, appreciated, alternating, as if I were a season to be scheduled, a plaque to be polished. And I drafted a reply that I never sent, a letter that said I was not an allowance or an exhibit. And then I closed the laptop and made soup, because there is a kind of nourishment no settlement can provide. By then, I had collected a small archive, the welfare check card, the bank printout, the neighborhood screenshot, the pharmacy, notes, the unsigned letter, and when I spread them on the table, they looked like the fossil record of a polite extinction. Each layer of sediment, a different method for removing me without admitting that was the project. And as the hearing approached, and the air felt weighted with the expectation that I would either implode or return chastened, I surprised even myself by sleeping well, because escalation can wake a person up, and once awake, you stop mistaking quiet for safety. You stop calling a locked door stability. You stop confusing a whispered insult with a misunderstanding. I ironed the jacket. I wrapped the folder with a rubber band. I placed the notebook with its ordinary miracles in my bag, and I walked to the bus stop beneath a sky that had finally chosen rain, the real kind that soaks through your resistance and leaves only what can withstand weather. And as the bus pulled up and the doors folded open with their familiar sigh, I thought about the way a storm builds without. Lightning, cloud by cloud, altered pressure, birds that go suddenly quiet, and I stepped on, dropped my change, and felt the city carry me forward, not to a battle I had asked for, but to the one a lifetime of small vanishing acts had earned. The midpoint arrived not with a gavel or a grand revelation, but with the strange quiet that settles when you've crossed the halfway mark of fear and realize you're still standing. I remember waking early the morning of my preliminary hearing and noticing that the air in my small apartment didn't feel borrowed anymore. The walls had begun to sound like mine when I moved. The kettle hissed, the same old blue enamel pot from decades ago, and I stood beside it as if listening for some verdict of my own resilience. I had expected dread, but what came instead was an odd, steady current of composure, a clarity that replaced trembling with something closer to focus. I put on the navy jacket I'd found at the thrift store, pinned my hair with the silver clip that had belonged to my mother, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw no trace of the apologetic woman who had waited by the door for permission to exist. I saw a witness preparing to testify about her own life. At the courthouse, the corridors smelled of paper, disinfectant, and mild despair. I walked past the security checkpoint, shoes squeaking, the deed folder tucked against my ribs like a small shield. Ms. Campbell met me by the elevators, her sensible heels planted firmly on the institutional tiles. She greeted me with a nod, not a hug, which I appreciated. Sympathy sometimes feels like pity when it's offered too soon. We rode the elevator in silence, and in that silence, I thought of Daniel's first day of school, how I had walked beside him up the steps with his hand gripping mine, both of us pretending to be braver than we were. Now it was me ascending, and my hand was empty. The hearing was procedural, brief, unglamorous, but inside those minutes, something subtle shifted. Carla was there, of course, every hair obedient to her will, her expression arranged somewhere between concern and restraint, the kind of expression you wear when you've rehearsed being misunderstood. Daniel sat beside her, his suit slightly too tight at the shoulders. They looked like a couple auditioning for the role of normality. When the judge called my name, I spoke clearly, my voice sounding older but also stronger, as if all the years of being interrupted had taught it how to stretch. The judge, a woman with sharp glasses and a tired smile, asked basic questions, my relation to the property, the timeline, the payments. I answered each one without apology, just fact layered upon fact. And then, when the opposing attorney suggested that perhaps Mrs. Cross had been confused about the nature of her involvement, something in me ignited. Confused. The word hung in the air like a slow insult. I leaned forward and said, "The only confusion here is assuming that gratitude and ownership cancel each other out." The courtroom went still, the kind of stillness that means truth has cracked the varnish of civility. Even the judge's pen paused midair before she said, "Noted, Mrs. Cross." Afterward, Ms. Campbell and I stood outside in the weak afternoon sun. She told me we had done well, that the case would proceed to mediation or trial, depending on how stubborn the other side wanted to be. I asked her how often mothers sued their sons. She looked at me steadily and said, "Less often than they should." I laughed, the sound scraping up from somewhere unused. It wasn't joy yet, but it was momentum. Back at the apartment, I opened the window wide, letting the noise of the street pour in. Honking, laughter, the rhythmic hiss of the bus brakes. It sounded like life continuing without permission. I brewed tea and sat at the small kitchen table covered with my papers, but instead of reading them, I began to write something new. Not the notes for the lawyer, but a letter to myself. I wrote, "You did not ruin the family. You simply refused to keep participating in its erasure." I taped it to the inside of the cupboard door, beside the jar of instant coffee, so I would see it each morning before the day started. That week became a rehearsal for independence. I learned the city bus routes, found a library that smelled faintly of dust and childhood, started cooking again. Simple meals that reminded me I could still feed myself without permission. In the evenings, I took slow walks around the block. The nail salon owner downstairs, a woman named Miha, would sometimes wave and hand me a pastry wrapped in napkin. We didn't share a language fully, but we understood exchange, food for company, gesture for recognition. I realized how long it had been since anyone had given me something without expecting gratitude that could be measured. Around that time, Daniel called again, this time without pretense. His voice was softer, almost bewildered. He said he didn't understand why I was taking things so far. I told him it wasn't far. It was just visible for once. He said Carla felt attacked. I reminded him that feelings are not facts. He grew quiet, and then, with a sigh that was half memory, half defeat, he said, "You sound different, Mom." I wanted to tell him that difference was what happens when silence stops being your native language. Instead, I said, "I am different." He hung up gently, like a man lowering a curtain on a scene he couldn't fix. Days folded into a rhythm of waiting, but it wasn't passive. Each morning I wrote in the notebook I'd started at the motel, recording everything, the calls, the letters, the temperature of my own resolve. I discovered that documentation itself can be an act of healing. It reminds you that your reality counts. Sometimes at night, I'd reread the entries and think about the long chain of women before me who'd been told to keep family matters quiet, to maintain dignity by erasing themselves. My mother, who hid bruises of disappointment under humor. My grandmother, who gave up land because she didn't want to cause a scene. Maybe this, I thought, was my small act of historical repair, to break the lineage of surrender. The midpoint came into sharper focus one Sunday when Ms. Campbell invited me to volunteer at a community legal clinic she ran for seniors. "You could help with intake forms," she said. "Nothing official, but you might like being around people who are trying to reclaim something." I went out of curiosity, and because loneliness is easier to manage when it has purpose. The clinic was held in a church basement, the tables lined with thermoses of coffee and boxes of donated pens. One woman came in clutching a rent notice she didn't understand, another with a stack of unpaid medical bills, and as I sat beside them, helping them write dates and addresses, I saw fragments of myself reflected back, a chorus of invisible people, learning to reappear in ink. When the afternoon ended, Ms. Campbell handed me a file to carry upstairs, and as we climbed the steps, she said, "You have a gift for making people believe they're not crazy for wanting fairness." It startled me, because for years that's all I'd wanted someone to do for me. That night I walked home slowly. The city had just turned its streetlights on, their halos stretching over puddles like small moons. I stopped at a bookstore that was closing down, everything half price, and bought a thin anthology of poems. At home, I read one line that stayed with me. "Courage is the quiet where fear expected an echo." I underlined it twice. It felt like a map of where I stood, halfway between the echo and the quiet. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild small rituals, polishing my shoes, ironing my clothes, making lists of groceries even when I had enough. Each task was a conversation with myself about order, control, belonging. The old need to explain my existence faded, replaced by a steadier pulse, the right to occupy space without justification. Sometimes, while stirring soup or folding laundry, I'd catch myself humming, a small sound of life returning to its source. Then, one afternoon, as I sorted through my mail, I found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a short note in handwriting I recognized instantly. Kieran's, my grandson's. It said only, "Dad says you're mad, Mom says you're sick, I don't know which is true, but I miss you. Are you okay?" The words looked shaky, uncertain, like the voice of a boy trying to bridge adult lies. I pressed the paper to my chest and realized that love can survive distortion. I wrote back that I was fine, that I loved him, that sometimes grown-ups confuse change with danger, and I mailed it before I could second-guess myself. For the first time since leaving that house, I felt connected not through obligation, but through choice. That night, the rain came heavy, drumming against the windows. I made tea and sat by the glass, watching the street lamps shimmer through the water. It occurred to me that maybe this was what recovery looked like. Not triumphant, not dramatic, but deliberate. A series of quiet decisions to keep moving toward air. I thought of my son and Carla, of the courtroom and the judge's pen pausing midair, of Ms. Campbell's eyes steady on mine, and I knew that whatever came next, I would no longer ask for permission to exist in my own story. The midpoint of any life is a kind of inventory. You count what remains, what was lost, what was never yours to begin with. Sitting there in the soft noise of rain, I understood that my life wasn't ending. It was resuming after a long intermission. The stage might be smaller, the audience indifferent, but the voice was finally mine, uncut, uncoached, and steady. The days after the letter from my grandson arrived passed with a deceptive calm, like the hush that falls before a storm remembers its purpose. I tried to live quietly, to let the case move through its channels like a current I no longer needed to steer, but still, I felt the tension gathering in the seams of my small routines. I noticed it in the way I began locking the door twice at night, in the way my breath shortened each time an unfamiliar number flashed across my phone. The first real sign of change came one Thursday afternoon when I returned from the library to find an envelope taped to my door with no stamp or address, just my name written in Carla's flawless, symmetrical handwriting. I stood there in the narrow hallway, the air around me holding its breath, and for a moment I considered tearing it in half without reading it. But curiosity is its own kind of injury. Inside was a single typed page, the language precise and venomless, the way poison can be when it doesn't need to advertise itself. She wrote that she and Daniel had reflected deeply and wanted to resolve matters privately, that litigation would only hurt everyone involved, and that if I insisted on continuing this path, she would be forced to disclose certain personal details that might not reflect well on anyone. No specifics, of course, just the shape of a threat, the implication that a woman my age must surely have secrets too fragile to withstand daylight. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound that startled even me. I had spent a lifetime carrying other people's shame, theirs and mine, and suddenly it struck me how light my own was compared to the weight of their performance. Still, I felt the tremor of something old and instinctive, fear of humiliation, fear of being dismissed as unstable, ungrateful, vindictive. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath the salt jar on the kitchen counter, as if pinning down a living thing so it couldn't slither away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Carla's phrasing, personal details, echoing through my thoughts like a mosquito that refuses to die. I tried to imagine what she could mean. Perhaps she would drag up my brief marriage after Peter died, the one I ended within a year, when I realized kindness wasn't love. Perhaps she would whisper about my panic attacks in the years after Peter's death, the way I once fainted at work and spent an evening in the emergency room, convinced my heart was failing. Or perhaps, more cruelly, she would invent something. She had that talent, the ability to blend truth and suggestion until even the people who loved you began to doubt their own eyes. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and made tea, the cheap black kind that stains the cup but keeps you anchored. Sitting at the table with the lamp burning low, I wrote a note to Ms. Campbell, describing the letter word for word. The act of recording it transformed the fear into evidence, and evidence into steadiness. I slipped the note into an envelope and decided I would deliver it to her office the next day in person. When morning came, the city felt gray and indifferent, a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. On the bus, I watched people absorbed in their phones, the small blue glow on their faces making them look like they were underwater. I thought about how isolation has modern disguises, a group chat without replies, a photo unliked, a family message thread that continues without your name. Carla's power came not just from cruelty, but from her fluency in social optics. She knew how to shape a narrative until the absence of your voice sounded like guilt. That realization frightened me more than her letter, because I knew that if she couldn't control me in person, she would try to control the story of me. At Ms. Campbell's office, the air smelled of coffee and toner. She read the letter, expression unreadable, then asked if I wanted to press charges for harassment. I shook my head. Not yet, I said. Let's see what shape her next move takes. Ms. Campbell nodded slowly, as though measuring the distance between patience and strategy. Then we'll document it, she said. If they contact you again outside of legal correspondence, forward everything to me. Her calm steadiness was a balm, but even as I left her office, I could feel the unease crawling back under my skin. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, it was Daniel. His voice was thin, worn, like a radio signal losing strength. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I told him I had nothing to say outside of the courtroom. "Please," he said, "just hear me out." I agreed to meet him at a cafe near the courthouse, mostly because curiosity had always been my undoing. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, with his head bowed over a cup of coffee gone cold. For a moment, I saw not the man who'd betrayed me, but the boy who used to cry when his kites tore in the wind. He looked up, and I saw guilt sitting behind his eyes like a tenant who had stopped paying rent. "Carla's not herself lately," he began, the phrase rehearsed. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand. She feels attacked. She is being held accountable," I corrected. He flinched. "Do you even know what this is doing to us?" he asked. To Kieran? That name, my grandson's name, landed like a stone. He misses you, but he's confused. You've made him think family is something you take to court. His words trembled with accusation, but his hands shook more. I realized then how deep Carla's hold went, how completely she had rewritten the story in his mind until my attempt at justice looked like an act of war. "You could stop this," he said softly. "You could come home." I stared at him. The phrase, "come home," cutting sharper than he knew. "There is no home," I said. "There's only a house full of people pretending I don't exist." He left angry, muttering something about lawyers and pride. I sat in the cafe long after he'd gone, the smell of burnt coffee thick in the air, and wondered if motherhood was meant to be a kind of amputation that never fully heals. I walked back to my apartment through streets slick with drizzle, each step heavy but certain. When I reached the door, I saw a note slipped beneath it. No handwriting this time, just a printed sheet that read, "You're making a mistake. Some things can't be undone." I laughed out loud, the sound too sharp for the quiet hall, because I had spent years undoing myself for their comfort, and now that I refused, they called it a mistake. In the following weeks, the pressure built. Carla began calling mutual friends, old neighbors, even my former coworkers, painting herself as the exhausted daughter-in-law, trying to manage an erratic elder. One of my old nursing colleagues, Martha, phoned to warn me. "She's telling people you're not well, that you're being manipulated by someone," she said. I told her I've known you 30 years, and you've never needed help thinking straight. I thanked her, but after hanging up, I felt the weight of it settling. Reputation, like trust, is easy to lose and impossible to reclaim fully. Still, part of me was almost relieved that the story was spreading. Exposure meant daylight, and daylight, even when harsh, made shadows honest. The second escalation reached its peak when Carla attempted to contact my landlord. He called me, uneasy, explaining that a woman claiming to be my daughter had phoned asking about my well-being and whether I was keeping up with rent. He said she'd sounded polite, but something about her tone didn't sit right. I assured him everything was fine and promised to handle it. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, the clock ticking with unbearable clarity. There was a point when I would have cried, would have folded under the exhaustion of being perpetually disbelieved. Instead, I opened the drawer, took out the folder, and added the landlord's note to the growing collection of documentation. Each paper felt like a brick in the wall I was building between their manipulation and my sanity. Then came the mediation session. I had dreaded it, not because I feared losing, but because I feared seeing what was left of my son's decency. The room was sterile, beige, with a circular table meant to symbolize equality. Carla sat across from me, composed, her smile thin and professional, as though she were hosting a conference. Daniel avoided my gaze. The mediator, a woman with a calm voice, honed by years of listening to lies disguised as misunderstandings, began by asking each of us to state what we wanted. Carla spoke first, using words like closure, family unity, and mutual respect. I said only acknowledgement and legal compliance. She smiled that brittle smile that always preceded cruelty and said, "You've always had our respect, Marianne. You just struggle with boundaries." I almost laughed at the irony. I had been respecting boundaries long before she was born, boundaries that excluded me, silenced me, aged me out of relevance. I said, "You mistake boundaries for walls you built around me and called safety." The mediator cleared her throat, sensing the air thickening. The session dragged on for hours, circling the same polite warfare. By the end, nothing was resolved, but something inside me hardened into certainty. There would be no compromise that required my disappearance. When we left, Carla leaned close and whispered, "You'll regret this." Her breath smelled of mint and menace. I looked at her and saw not power, but desperation, the kind that comes when someone realizes the mask they built no longer fits. "I already did," I said. The following weekend, I took a train out of the city to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through courtrooms and threats. The countryside rolled past in muted greens and browns, the sky wide and unscripted. I stayed in a small inn, the kind with creaky floors and floral curtains, and for 2 days I spoke to almost no one. I walked, I wrote, I slept. The stillness allowed the noise inside me to settle. On the last morning, I sat on a bench overlooking a field and thought about the version of myself that had spent years trying to be pleasant, the woman who apologized for her own shadow. She was gone now, not dead, but integrated, her softness intact, but her silence retired. When I returned to the city, the final tremor of escalation waited for me like an unpaid bill. A letter from the court lay in my mailbox, the official date for trial. The words looked almost ceremonial on the page, the culmination of months of disbelief, humiliation, and endurance. I ran my finger over the embossed seal and felt a rush of something that wasn't fear, wasn't even anger. It was vindication's quiet prelude. They had tried every soft weapon, guilt, gossip, intimidation, narrative, and still here I was, uncollapsed, documented, prepared. That night, as I stood by the window, watching the city's lights flicker like restless thoughts, I realized that escalation isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's evolution, the final shedding of roles too small to contain the truth. I had started as a mother begging for understanding, and I had become a woman demanding justice. In between lay the battlefield of politeness, that dangerous terrain where women are taught to die quietly. I had crossed it one careful step at a time, carrying nothing but a folder, a notebook, and the unyielding conviction that survival is a form of testimony. When the clock struck midnight, I poured myself a small glass of wine, my first in years, and toasted the empty room. To visibility, I whispered. The rain began to fall again, soft and persistent, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn called through the dark. I stood there listening, the letter from the court in my hand, and felt the storm finally crest within me, not to destroy, but to clear the air for whatever came next. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sharp light that made everything appear too honest, the kind of light that reveals fingerprints on glass and hesitation in eyes. I woke before dawn, long before the alarm, and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence that always comes before irreversible things. My jacket hung on the chair, pressed and waiting, my folder thick with papers, receipts, and letters that had become the architecture of my survival. I made coffee and stood by the window while the city began to stir. Each sound, the first bus, the faint whistle of the bakery vent, reminding me that the world would continue no matter how the day ended. I wasn't frightened exactly, not in the way I had imagined. Fear had calcified into something quieter, a kind of steady readiness. I thought of my mother again, of how she used to say that dignity was the only inheritance poverty couldn't steal, and I wondered if she could see me now, walking into a courthouse to reclaim something larger than property. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, less like the grand halls of justice from television, and more like a conference room with a witness stand and tired walls. The judge from the earlier hearing was presiding again, her hair tied back, her glasses balanced low on her nose. Ms. Campbell met me at the door, her eyes sharp, her briefcase heavy with precision. Across the room, Carla sat beside Daniel, immaculate as ever, her calmness rehearsed, the faintest smirk flickering across her mouth when she saw me. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. For a moment, I felt a pang so deep, I thought it might split me open, the memory of his small hand in mine, the smell of his hair after summer camp, the echo of a boy who once said he'd never let anyone make me cry. And yet here we were, each of us cast in a story he couldn't rewrite. The proceedings began with formalities, the monotone reading of filings, case numbers, property descriptions, numbers that meant nothing and everything. When it was our turn, Ms. Campbell rose and spoke in the measured cadence of a woman who had long ago learned that truth delivered without apology is its own kind of weapon. She laid out the evidence, the financial records, the contributions, the proof of ownership. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that filled the room. Then the opposing lawyer stood, sleek and young, his confidence brittle in its freshness. He began to speak about family context, about emotional dynamics, about how I had perhaps misunderstood the intentions of my son and daughter-in-law. He used words like generational miscommunication and emotional fatigue. Each phrase landed like a drop of acid on paper, polite but corrosive. He suggested that my involvement in the property had always been symbolic, that my contributions were gestures of maternal support rather than financial partnership. I felt my stomach twist, not from shock, but from the nauseating familiarity of being reduced to symbolism. Then it was Carla's turn. She stood, a performance already written in her posture. Her voice was soft, trembling just enough to appear sincere. "I never wanted this," she said. "I love Marianne. She's been part of our family from the start, but in recent years she's become unpredictable, forgetful. Sometimes she says things that aren't true, and we just wanted to protect her." Her eyes glistened with rehearsed tears. I watched the judge's pen move slowly across the page, not sure whether she was writing or simply marking time. Carla continued, weaving her story with surgical precision, turning every instance of cruelty into concern, every act of control into compassion. When she finished, she sat down and reached for Daniel's hand. He looked at her like a man seeking a script in a language he no longer understood. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Cross," she said, "do you wish to respond?" I stood, feeling the years gather behind me like an invisible choir. I didn't glance at my papers. I didn't need them. My voice, when it came, was steady, not loud, but unflinching. "What she calls protection," I said, "was containment. What she calls love was possession. I may be 74, but I am not confused, and I am not forgetful. I remember every payment I made, every wall I painted, every night I stayed in that house caring for my grandson while they traveled. I remember when she called me embarrassing. I remember when they changed the locks. I remember when they stopped using my name. But what I remember most is realizing that silence only protects the one doing the harm." I paused, not for effect, but because the truth needed space to breathe. "I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm asking for recognition of what already exists in law, and in fact, my name is on that deed. I have a right to be acknowledged, and I will not be erased politely." For a moment, the room was completely still. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The judge studied me, her eyes softened by something that looked almost like respect. Then she turned to Carla. "Do you have anything to say in response?" Carla's composure faltered for the first time. "It's just that," she began, but the judge interrupted her gently. "Mrs. Cross appears quite lucid to me." She turned back to the clerk. "Let's proceed with the documentation." That single sentence felt like a key turning inside a long-locked door. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur of legal language, signatures, and the dry rustle of paper. When the judge finally announced her decision, that the property would be sold and the proceeds divided according to the verified contributions, I felt no triumph, only an enormous exhale, as if the air that had been trapped in my chest for years was finally leaving my body. Carla's face drained of its practiced serenity. Daniel looked at me, his expression unreadable, something between anger and grief. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him that love survives even when trust doesn't, but I knew it wasn't the time. The court adjourned, chairs scraped, voices murmured, and Ms. Campbell placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You did it," she said. I nodded, though what I felt wasn't victory, it was release. Outside, the sky had turned that brittle blue that comes after rain, sharp and cleansing. Carla and Daniel exited the building ahead of me. She walked fast, her heels clicking like punctuation marks of frustration, while he lagged behind. For a moment, he turned, our eyes met, and I saw the boy again, the one who used to beg for one more bedtime story. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came, and then he turned away. I let him go. Sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to follow someone into their own blindness. I walked to the park across the street and sat on a bench, the same bench where, months earlier, I'd eaten a sandwich between lawyer meetings. The trees were shedding the first of their leaves, a slow gold drift that felt almost ceremonial. I opened my folder, looked at the stamped judgment, and realized that for the first time in years, no one could take this away from me. Not through gaslight, not through gossip, not through guilt. My name was mine again, visible in ink. A man feeding pigeons nearby nodded at me. I smiled back, a small acknowledgement between strangers. I thought about all the women who would never reach this moment. Women still trapped in kitchens and living rooms, silenced by love's counterfeit versions, persuaded to believe that self-respect is selfishness. I wanted to tell them what I had learned, that reclaiming your life is not cruelty, that boundaries are not betrayal, that you can survive being called ungrateful and still be whole. When I finally stood to leave, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the path. I walked slowly, feeling the ache in my knees, but also the strength beneath it. I passed the courthouse steps, where a younger woman sat crying into her phone, her voice low but fierce. I wanted to reach out to her, to say, "You will not disappear if you tell the truth," but I didn't interrupt. She would find her own voice in time, just as I had found mine. That evening, back in my apartment, I poured another cup of coffee and opened the window wide. The air smelled of wet pavement and beginnings. I placed the court documents on the table beside my notebook, and for the first time since leaving that house, I didn't feel the need to lock the door. The fight was over, but something larger had begun. A quiet ownership, not of property, but of self. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, not to Ms. Campbell or to Daniel, but to the woman I used to be, the one who stayed silent too long. "You were never embarrassing," I wrote. "You were evidence. You were the truth they couldn't bear to see." Then I signed my name, full and unshortened, and left the paper on the table as the light faded into evening. Outside, the city kept moving, buses sighing, people calling out, life tumbling forward. But inside that small room, for once, time felt perfectly still. The battle had ended not with applause or forgiveness, but with the steady heartbeat of a woman who had finally remembered that her voice was never the problem. It was the proof. When the judgment money came through, it arrived not as triumph, but as silence, a direct deposit that blinked on the screen like a small, discreet acknowledgement from the universe. No one congratulated me. There were no flowers, no reconciliation. Only numbers in a bank account and the kind of quiet that feels both earned and heavy. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had held my documents and my doubts for months, and stared at the confirmation message until the digits blurred into something abstract. For so long, I had fought for validation. Now that I had it, I felt no celebration, only the stillness that follows a storm when even the air seems stunned by its own survival. I thought about how many years I had mistaken noise for belonging, chaos for closeness, obligation for love. The truth was simpler and lonelier. I had wanted to matter, and for the first time I did, but only to myself. I moved the following month. Not far, just to a smaller apartment on the east side of the city, a building with crooked floors and sunlit mornings that stretched long across the wooden planks. The landlord, a quiet man with soft eyes, helped carry my boxes up the stairs. When he asked if anyone would be joining me, I said no. It was the first time I'd said it without flinching. I unpacked slowly, methodically, placing my books in neat rows, stacking dishes that had followed me through decades, and hanging a single picture on the wall, one of me holding Daniel as a baby, both of us looking at the camera with the startled intimacy of people who don't yet know how easily love can become currency. I thought about removing it, but something inside me resisted. The picture was not an indictment. It was a record. I left it there, proof of what had once been pure. In the days that followed, I began to notice how stillness changes its shape, depending on what fills it. The same silence that once felt like exile now felt like possibility. I woke early each morning, made tea, and opened the window to listen to the city's slow awakening, the vendors calling from the corner, the buses sighing, the pigeons conversing in secretive bursts. My life had become small, but not diminished. There was an elegance and simplicity, a kind of luxury in being unobserved. I learned to cook just for myself, to portion joy without witnesses. I bought a cheap radio from a thrift shop and let it play quietly through the afternoons, the music filling the gaps that once ached. Sometimes I would catch myself humming along, surprised by how naturally the sound returned to me. One morning, I walked to the local library to return a book and noticed a bulletin board by the entrance filled with small notices, lost cats, piano lessons, and a flyer for a volunteer reading program at a nearby elementary school. The flyer asked for older adults to read to children once a week. I tore off one of the tabs without thinking. The following week, I found myself sitting on a low chair in a bright classroom, surrounded by curious eyes. The children called me Miss Mary, a compromise between respect and affection, and for an hour each Wednesday, I became a voice that carried stories into new ears. It wasn't redemption I felt there, nor forgiveness, but something humbler and steadier, continuation. Occasionally, Daniel would text, short, polite messages. Hope you're doing okay. Kieran won his soccer match. I never ignored him, but I didn't rush to reply either. My responses were brief, factual, without the hunger that once clung to every word I sent him. I had stopped waiting for him to change. Sometimes at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city's sounds softened into distance, I wondered if he ever thought of me with something like regret. I didn't need an answer. Some questions exist only to measure how far you've come from needing one. In early autumn, I received a letter, not from Daniel or Carla, but from Kieran. It was handwritten, clumsy and earnest, the way only a child's sincerity can be. He said he missed me, that he wanted to visit, that his mother thought it wasn't a good idea, but his father said he could decide for himself. He asked if I still made the lemon cookies he liked. I cried when I read it, not because of sadness, but because of how small hope can be and still be enough. I wrote back that the cookies were waiting, that he could come whenever he wanted, and that no matter what he'd been told, love doesn't disappear. It just changes its address. When he came, a few weeks later, he stood taller than I remembered, all elbows and hesitation. We baked cookies together in my small kitchen, spilling flour across the counter, laughing at the mess. He told me about school, about his friends, about how his mother had stopped mentioning me. I didn't ask questions. Children shouldn't have to mediate adult cowardice. When he left, he hugged me quickly but tightly, the kind of hug that lingers after the body departs. I watched him walk down the street and thought, maybe this is what inheritance truly means, not property or bloodlines, but the quiet endurance of affection. The seasons turned gently. I began to write more, small essays and letters I never sent. Some I mailed to women I'd met through the legal clinic, women still trapped in the gray corridors of silence. I told them that it's never too late to speak, that survival doesn't require forgiveness, that peace can exist alongside disappointment. The act of writing felt like building a bridge backward, not to return, but to understand the path. Sometimes, when I walk through the park on weekends, I pass the courthouse. It doesn't look threatening anymore, just another building full of papers and ghosts. I stop by the bench where I once sat holding the stamped judgment, and I breathe deeply, the air cool and unburdened. I no longer replay the trial in my head. I no longer see Carla's face in my dreams. I see light, trees, children running, the small ordinariness of a world that keeps going. I sit there for a while and think about how endings rarely arrive as fireworks. They come as breathing space, as the absence of dread, as the slow return of appetite. When I return home, I sometimes open the notebook I began on the first night in the motel. The pages are dense with fear and fury, but near the end, the handwriting changes, steadier, broader, as if the hand had learned to trust its own authority. On the final page, beneath a half-finished thought, I add one more line. They said I was embarrassing, but I learned that embarrassment is just what power calls truth when it comes from the wrong mouth. I close the notebook and slide it onto the shelf beside the books I've kept all my life. The apartment is quiet, but not empty. The air hums with presence my own. And so this is how it ends, not with reconciliation, not with bitterness, but with the calm of a woman who has reclaimed the smallest, rarest possession of all, the right to live unobserved, uncorrected, and entirely herself.